I rise to speak to the Terrorism and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 2025 and support the intelligent and considered contribution of my colleague and Greens Justice spokesperson Sue Higginson, who is, as I said, the Justice spokesperson. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that we are here in terrible, unthinkable circumstances because two men, radicalised extremists, anti-Semites, under a banner of ISIS, whether formally recruited or inspired is yet to be determined, took guns legally owned by one of the killers and opened fire on a peaceful Jewish celebration at Bondi Beach on the evening of Sunday, the 14th of December. 15 innocent people were killed, another 40 were injured, some still in critical care. So many lives forever changed, scarred by these acts of evil. So too Sydney and our state, forever changed by these horrific acts. Now, the Premier has chosen to recall Parliament to pass what he said initially was to tighten gun laws to help prevent another mass shooting in this state. The Greens support the tightening of gun laws. However, this bill goes much further than that because the Premier has chosen to use this terrorist attack to launch his own attack, an attack on one of the most fundamental aspects of any healthy democracy, the right to peacefully assemble, the right for people to turn out in non-violent, peaceful protest. In the days after the terrorist attack, the Premier deliberately and without any proof linked the vocal, visible support for Palestine and criticism of the actions of the Israeli government in Gaza to that attack. He said, "When you see people marching and showing violent, bloody images of death and destruction, it's unleashing something in our community that the organisers of the protest can't contain." And then he went on, "The truth of the matter is we can't risk another mass demonstration on that scale in New South Wales. The implications can be seen, in my view, on Sunday." And then, Madam Deputy President, now, many of the speeches in this place today have echoed those sentiments, again, without any proof, as if everyone here are experts on terrorism, on religiously motivated violent extremism. To hear at least one member in this place from the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party say that the people, including many Jewish Australians who marched across the bridge, who have gathered on weekends in Hyde Park to plead for an end to the genocide, an end to the war in Gaza, which has killed tens of thousands of people, innocent children, to say that these people have blood on their hands is the very last thing that we as elected members should be doing right now. In fact, it's the very opposite of what we need to be doing right now, and it is incredibly dangerous. Shifting blame onto the type of people who left their warm homes on that rainy Sunday to march for human rights and against wars is the very type of behaviour, of actions, of words of elected members that drives further division and more violence in our communities. I've been to some of those rallies, including the wonderful, peaceful, love-filled March for Humanity across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in August, along with upwards of 100,000, potentially 200, 300,000 Sydney-siders and those who had travelled from the regions to be there in the pouring rain. To be there together, to take a stand, to urge that more be done to stop the slaughter of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian children, women and men in Gaza at the hands of the Netanyahu Israeli government. That does not make them anti-Semites. That does not make them extremists. And it certainly does not make them responsible for the terrorist attack on Sunday, the 14th of December. People who marched for humanity on the 3rd of August 2025 across the Sydney Harbour Bridge did so out of compassion for others. They marched against violence. They marched against war. They marched to support many members of the Australian Muslim community in expressing their horror, their horror, their distress, their trauma at the relentless genocide. At the relentless genocide by the Netanyahu government in Gaza. The bombings of hospitals and aid workers and journalists, the deliberate withholding of aid, the deliberate starvation of the Palestinian people, including children, and the horror that world governments did not stop it. The Premier's reference to people marching with violent, bloody images of death and destruction, which was unleashing something in our community that the organisers of the protest can't contain. The only images that fit this category at the marches and rallies I've attended are handmade placards with photos of the dead bodies of babies and children. Bloodied, yes, terrible, shocking, distressing to look at, because they've been violently killed by the bombs dropped by the Israeli government. And I guess the people are really trying to make that point. If you follow the logic of this statement, then that perhaps the Premier should have been working on Netanyahu a bit more to stop the dropping of the bombs. Instead, the Premier is stopping Australians coming together peacefully to voice their opposition to the dropping of bombs. Just like almost 500,000 people did more than 22 years ago, I was one of them, in March 2003, when they turned out in protest against Australia, joining George Bush and Tony Blair in a war against Iraq on dubious, later to be found false, intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. That's what we do. That's what the people of this country have done. That's what they did in against the Vietnam War, and we should be able to continue to do so peacefully and non-violently. In fact, the 2003 march against the war in Iraq occurred after the Labor government under Bob Carr introduced the Terrorist Police Powers Bill in 2002. Importantly, at the time, then Premier Carr said, we need to remain calm in the face of terrorism and not surrender unnecessarily civil liberties that are part of the fabric of our working democracy. Well, unfortunately, that's what we're doing here today, Madam Deputy President, under the Minns Labor government. And the worst part of it all, under absolutely no proof that the extraordinary powers in this bill to stop protests for up to 90 days at a time will make the people of this state, including the Jewish community, any safer at all against another terrorist attack. If the government knows something that other members of this parliament don't about that, then perhaps now is the time to let us know. Here's what has been publicly released about the killers, the terrorists, and I've searched, but I haven't been able to find anything about attending any protests. You know, who knows, that could come up, but at this point, not there. It includes the eldest shooter applying for a firearms licence in 2015, which lapsed after he failed to provide a photograph. It includes the younger shooter coming to the attention of ASIO in 2019, being seen in the company of men linked to an IS terror cell, including one man who was jailed for 7 years because of his plans to establish an Islamic State terrorist insurgency group in Australia, and another who was an active IS youth recruiter. It includes applying for a gun licence in 2020 and finally being granted in 2023 to the father, who then purchased 6 guns, which all of that, incidentally, was well before the 7th of October 2023, well before the March for Humanity or the other weekly protests in Hyde Park. Details have also emerged of photos taken of them firing guns somewhere in regional New South Wales. This year, ASIO declared the threat level of a likelihood of a terrorism event in Australia to probable. That means there's a greater than 50% chance of an onshore attack or attack planning in the next 12 months. Incredibly, federal and state governments are now assessing whether criminal intelligence gathered by security agencies could be used when making assessments about applications for gun licences, because it is currently only determined on a person's criminal history. In 2022, the Victorian Parliament held an inquiry into extremism in that state. It found that racism and racist scapegoating, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are common elements of far-right extremist ideologies, messaging and activities. This is not new, or hopefully not contested information for most of us. So why didn't the Premier mention the Marches for Australia as a potential risk? Clearly promoted and attended by white supremacists, by racists, by anti-Semites. Instead, he blamed the mums and dads and kids who are horrified at war, horrified at genocide and the killing of innocents, the people who marched for compassion. Why didn't he say anything at the time? He did say something at the time, I'll correct that. Why didn't he say anything after Sunday the 14th of December about the appalling neo-Nazi display that was able to recently take place outside Parliament with the police watching on? Madam Deputy President, right now, at this critical time, we must ensure that our efforts to combat anti-Semitism are done in a way that doesn't further divide our increasingly fragile social fabric. And we must ensure that it isn't done in a way that allows other drivers of extremism to escape scrutiny. Indeed, other potential violent terrorists to escape scrutiny. I ask members, do you honestly think there isn't a scenario where another horrific terrorist act could have occurred in Sydney in recent years, a very different terrorist attack? Like the hate-filled evil attack which occurred in Christchurch in March 2019, 28-year-old white Australian male went on a shooting spree, murdering 51 people and injuring 40 others, Muslim, at a mosque in Christchurch. Or, heaven forbid, a terrible attack on our public transport network. The Royal Commission that was held into that Christchurch attack found that the killer displayed racist behaviour from a young age. Remember, he grew up in Australia. His life experiences appeared to have fuelled resentment, and that he became a radicalised, forming extreme right-wing views about people he considered a threat. Eventually, that mobilised to violence, and he spent a long time planning and preparing for the attack, just like those two killers on Sunday. The head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, when releasing this year's threat assessment outlook, said, "At the height of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, offshore groups or individuals were inspiring and directing attacks in Australia. Now, extremists are self-radicalising, choosing their own adventure, and often their own unique, blended belief system. At the height of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, individuals would usually be radicalised over an extended time period. Now, the process can take days and weeks rather than months and years. At the height of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, individuals would often be influenced by family members or associates who held extremist views. Now, the most likely perpetrator of a terrorist attack is a lone actor from a family previously unconnected to extremism. At the height of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, extremism tended to be concentrated in major cities. Now, extremism is much more diffuse and much more diverse." He went on, "We are seeing an increase in issue-motivated extremism, fuelled by personal grievance, conspiracy theories, and anti-authority ideologies. This means you cannot assume there is a single type of terrorist threat or even a most likely motivation for a terrorist attack. Yet members in this place and the Premier have already worked it all out. They have jumped on pro-Palestinian sentiment as the cause of this horrific terror attack because it suits them politically." Mike Burgess also said, "The impacts of social media, mental health, the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories, ubiquitous encryption, growing grievance, and the radicalisation of minors all require whole of government, whole of community, whole of society responses." His words, not mine. "You cannot arrest your way to social cohesion. You cannot regulate your way to fewer grievances. You cannot spy your way to less youth radicalisation. The end of Mike Burgess's quote. Instead, we have this hastily pulled together legislation which will have far-reaching consequences. I think it's extraordinary listening to all the members' contributions today. There's a hell of a lot I disagree with, but we all agree that this is an outrageous, hastily pulled together bill on very significant issues that we should have had a lot more time to deal with, and the community should have been more or at least consulted in any way on it. Our state has changed forever because of the despicable acts of two racially motivated, religiously motivated, anti-Semitic, violent extremists who opened fire on hundreds of innocent people on Sunday, the 14th of December 2025. As lawmakers of this state, our response must be to ensure that we support the Jewish community in their grief by doing more to genuinely combat anti-Semitism, along with other racially and ideologically motivated extremism. But we must protect our democracy while doing so. We must come together and work towards peace, to understand each other, to accept our differences. We must teach tolerance, compassion, and respect. We're so lucky to live in Australia and to be able to live free from war and famine and tyrannical leaders and violent, disparate terrorist groups who have a total disregard for humanity. We're so lucky to live in a democracy. It's far from perfect, but it's pretty bloody healthy comparatively, and when it's under attack, you realise just how pretty bloody wonderful it is. A healthy democracy means being able to engage in non-violent protest, to rally on the streets, to criticise the government and to criticise other governments. The parts of this bill which restrict peaceful protest puts our democracy at risk. That's a very, very dangerous thing right now. And it is why the Greens cannot in all conscience vote for this bill.